sermon or class. You have more that you can do next time. Because it says every time you try to cram more in, you're just going to be squeezing stuff out the other ear.
Yes, that's true.
There's only so much that people can process in one block, and keep it focused. And today we're going to focus on Miketz. So we, again, have to do a little quick review. Last week in Vayeshev, we began the Joseph cycle. It began famously with Joseph being sold off into slavery, and Joseph was then the head slave for Potiphar's house until Mrs. Potiphar had a bit of an issue, and then he ends up in jail. It's dreams, and the idea, of course, is that having interpreted the dreams successfully for the cupbearer, he's just waiting now for the cupbearer to mention him, drop the name, put in a good word, exactly, because it's not what you know, it's who you know, to get out of this prison and be recognized for the truly excellent person that he is. And that eventually happens. And because of our focus for this week, we're not going to go through the whole dream sequence with Pharaoh, but what was the gist of the dream? Message that Pharaoh was getting?
Yes.
All right. 7 of plenty and 7 of famine. So that lovely dream about the ears of corn, grain. Remember, they didn't actually have corn like corn on the cob corn, and the cows and all of that God was giving to Pharaoh to understand 7 of plenty, 7 of famine, and that's it. What's Joseph's contribution then, apart from just making the interpretation?
Well, then he helps get them through those 7 years.
Okay.
And then the 7 years of famine.
So often overlooked, right? So many people seem to think that once the dream was interpreted, it came with a ready-made instruction set for what do you do next. But Pharaoh could have gotten this information. There's 7 years of plenty coming, followed by 7 years of famine. Oh, wow. All right, well, let's live it up now, guys. And just we'll see what happens when the famine rolls around. I mean, after all, I'm Pharaoh, so if there's going to be any food in the land, it's probably going to be me eating. So what do I care? Joseph is the one who, comes up with a plan. And it's that plan and some of the underlying issues that it reveals that I want to focus on today. Good? Good. Page 254, if you are in the Eitz Chaim.
Preparing for the future doesn't
I'm sorry, 253. Go ahead.
Preparing for the future doesn't seem to be intuitively obvious.
Preparing for the future is not always intuitively obvious. Yeah. And even when you know the future, preparing for it is not always intuitively obvious.
People do that today.
Well, that's the point, exactly.
How few people say.
Right. I mean, people know they will retire, or even if they don't retire, eventually they will be unable to work. So that means I should spend all my money now.
I was the other day with a nurse yesterday who was carrying food from the cafeteria, and she says, I know I'm spending a lot of money on food. I could have brought this from home. When I get home, I don't feel like doing it. My refrigerator is full of food at home too, but I'm spending a lot of money on food. That's it.
Self-awareness is nice, but
Yeah.
But it didn't go anyplace. Right.
All the information is there. All the values and priorities are there.
Exactly.
But somehow translating it into action.
it's something about implementation.
Yeah.
It's just too hard.
And it surprised me. She's a well-educated woman. And
Clearly, right? She's a nurse, right?
Exactly. And yet, could not plan better.
Or had other things that she would rather be doing than taking care of that, but not recognizing that was the underlying choice. Instead, it just seems to be this, how did this happen that I'm holding food that I had to spend money on when I had plenty of food I could have brought from home? What a strange situation. And that's kind of where we are.
Binge buying.
Binge buying. I like the phrase, binge buying. More than just binge buying, most of us at many different times in our life, we get a clear vision of our future, as clear as this, and don't necessarily know what to do with that information or how to make what we want to do happen. And that's what we're going to talk about, or at least a couple different ways that can work or not work. So this is chapter 41,
41.
and we're beginning with verse 33. Yeah, so actually it's on page 253. It's the last tiny bit of sentence. Yeah, all the way at the bottom if you're in the Eitz Chaim. But chapter 41, verse 33 if you're in another copy. Shall we?
Accordingly, let Pharaoh find a man of discernment and wisdom and set him over the land of Egypt.
All right, so notice what's the first part of Joseph's solution for this?
That Pharaoh find someone to take over and take care of this.
Appoint.
Appoint, yes.
You should put someone in charge of this. Now that's a Yiddish
Promotion.
right? Yeah, so he doesn't, Joseph doesn't have anyone in particular in mind. But, he sees this issue and says, okay, what are you going to do about this? Well, you got to get someone in charge. Now, who is in charge? Pharaoh's in charge, right? He's already in charge. But Joseph sees that Pharaoh needs someone to take over this because, well, Pharaoh does not seem to understand where to go with this. So appoint someone who knows, who has wisdom, who has understanding. Someone. Does he really mean himself?
No.
I don't know that he means himself in the sense that if Pharaoh didn't, he would say, you're violating the dream.
No.
But I think he does mean himself in the sense that he thinks he could do the job. Because he goes on not only to say that you should appoint, but here's what the person you appoint should do in some detail. It's like, and if selected for the job, this is how I would carry it out. So he's already giving his proposal as though he is in the running, at least, to be one of the appointees.
They did that once in a meeting 30 years ago. They gave a contract to somebody else.
You know what you...
Do it and all that.
And he gave it all away, and then they said, thank you very much for your time and input. We're going to pay him to do what you just said.
Exactly.
Yes, that's a kick in the teeth. Thankfully, Pharaoh is smart enough to recognize that Joseph is the person for the job, because Joseph goes on with some more details.
And let Pharaoh take steps to appoint overseers over the land and organize the land of Egypt in the 7 years of plenty.
All right, so I'm going to pause there
Organize.
because we got Hebrew. All right. Thank you. What's the word?
Organize.
Organize. What's the word in Hebrew that means organize? In our pasuk.
Oh, you know, pasuk.
Yeah, not in general. I mean in our pasuk. So yes, right. So lisader would be a word that could work, but that's not in our pasuk. So what's the word that's being used?
Chimesh.
All right. So chimesh is the word that's being used to mean organize, but does that always mean to organize?
No.
What else could it mean? What?
To get, usually for a war,
Mhm.
get armaments and get ready for a war. That's Chimesh. Or to build walls to
Mhm.
protect.
To fortify.
Fortify.
Right.
Yeah.
To fortify, to organize a militia, and in fact, and we're going to just jump a little bit. We're going to see this a little bit clearer. If you want to take a peek at Exodus 13:18, hello. In Exodus 13:18, you'll see that V'chamoshim, the Israelites went up armed out of the land of Egypt. They went up prepared for war. We're on page 400. Sorry, if you're looking in the Eitz Chaim, right? So it's the third line in the Hebrew. V'chamoshim, they go up armed for war. They're in the translation. They are organized for war. They are prepared for war. But is that the only thing that root chimesh could mean? Because I have to point out the modern Hebrew is heavily influenced by this understanding. So it's kind of a chicken and egg problem. But what's the root itself mean? Chamesh. It's a number.
Yeah.
Oh,
Right? To divide by 5. Right, to fifth something, to organize things. Now, this may be that they were organizing them in a particular numerical way, and then that became kind of the pattern that was used as a generic verb. But it's got a certain numerical quality to it. Now, our translator has gone with the nice stable organize as his translation. We're going to come back to that when we get to some other commentators. But I just wanted to put that word himesh onto your radar, because that will come back.
So it has the connotation, the denotation of organizing into 5 segments or something like that?
So it doesn't have to be organizing into 5s, but it definitely has a semantic relationship to the number 5. So it doesn't always show up that you're organizing things in 5s, like the section that we read in Exodus, and that the people were going up armed for war. There's no feeling of 5ths there, but there is definitely a root connection to that as an overlap. Make sense?
Yes.
Maybe, I mean, getting the origin of words is always tricky. So,
In my book, it says here.
oh wait, were you reading the commentary? Oh yeah. Yeah, we're gonna get to Onkelos. We're gonna get to Onkelos, and we're also gonna get to Rashbam and Ibn Ezra. So you can go ahead and start peeking at them. But not everyone has the same edition with commentators. That's why I've got them on the sheets. So we're gonna get to them in just a second. But yeah, I wanted to get that on the radar. So you can fill us in on Onkelos in just a moment. But for the moment, we need to finish the paragraph. Now we're organized.
Let all the food of these good years that are coming be gathered, and let the grain be collected under Pharaoh's authority as food to be stored in the cities. Let that food be a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which will come upon the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish in the famine.
All right. So what's the plan? We're appointing, right? We're organizing, and
We're going to store food.
all right.
So that we can keep it for 7 years, so that when the famine comes, we will have food in the storehouses.
We're going to collect and store,
Collect and store.
and then we're going to distribute.
You know what I think? Himesh comes into play now. 20% of the food in the 7 years should be saved for the next bad 7 years.
Let's go around.
Good idea.
Yes, that will do it. The Himesh is the 20% to save.
All right, just waiting for the handouts to go around. We're going to look at a comment first that comes in slightly different ways, but both from Rashbam and Ibn Ezra, which is indeed going to play on this himesh as being more than just organization. So Harry, could you read that first paragraph?
And let him appoint overseers and take up the 5th part.
All right, so the first thing that happens here is, rather than using himesh to mean organize, Rashbam and Ibn Ezra says, no. The organize was already there. Appoint overseers. That's the organization. The himesh is the specific recommendation of what they should then do, which is 1/5, or as Yarach said, 20%. Right? My math is correct there. 1/5 and 20% are the same thing. So take a 5th. Why would that be? Or keep going?
That the overseer should collect 1/5 of all the crops for the needs of the king, where the general law in other years was to take 1/10, as it states in Shmuel, and your fields he will take 1/10. Now you will take twice that. And similarly did Joseph do at the end. And Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt unto this day, that Pharaoh should have the 5th.
All right, so later on, when Joseph is doing his deals with the people of Egypt, he ends up instituting a 1/5 payment for the right of the people to work on the land which had been forfeit to Pharaoh during the famine. That's going to become their permanent obligation to Pharaoh, is 20% of whatever they grow. And that would be double the usual. What do we know the usual? Because of Shmuel. Shmuel says 1/10, right? So this is double usual. So that's what's happening here. Because otherwise, no, what's the big deal? Doesn't the king always collect, food from people as taxes? Yes, but he should collect more than usual, twice as much, twice of 1/10, 1/5. Is that a question, comment? No? Okay, so his idea, or rather their idea, Rashbam and Ibn Ezra, is that this 1/5 is about getting a 20% collection. We'll come back to the math in a minute for those of you that are math and accounting mavens. But I do want to point out, as Yarach was pointing out, Onkelos has a slightly different version.
It's in Targum Onkelos and encourage/organize, and so too,
V'chamushim, which was in Shum.
Oh,
Right, so it's the same root, right? And like a chumash, right? It's the same root. But there, Rashi says, and here, it should be considered as organized, not as in not one-fifth it, but organize it. So we get a debate among our commentators. Again, this is always one of those great points to stop and say, anyone who tells you they always read the Bible literally, according to which meaning of the word, right? You're going to have to stop and ask many, many points. So does this mean organize here, or does this mean take 20%? Because both meanings work in context. We're going to stick with the 20%, just because we know that something has to be collected, and it's going to make the rest of our commentary seem a little bit more applicable. So it could be the either. I'm not trying to say Rashi and Onkelos are wrong, God forbid. But for the moment, for our discussion, we're going to work off that one-fifth it as a specific collection goal, rather than just organize it. Okay, so Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, wonderful rabbi of the 1800s, he did some special math for us.
in years of abundance, human nature is to eat double.
Right? If you got extra, you gorge, you eat up. It's what people do, right? Yes, yes.
And during years of famine, human nature is to eat half of what one normally intakes.
Most of us could probably get by for a year eating half of what we currently eat, or maybe even less, depending upon how much we've stored in our years of plenty. So double some years, half the other.
Hence, in years of high quantity, one would eat 4 times what one eats in a famine year.
Right? We'll make sure we got that clear. Right? In a regular year of plenty, you would be consuming twice what you eat in an average year. And in a year of famine, you'd be eating half of what you eat in an average year. Therefore, from the extremes, the plenty to the famine, it's actually a 4 times additional food boost. That math makes sense? Good, because I don't want to go through it again because it hurts. I'm no accountant.
The 1/5 formula ensured that even in the famine years, there would be enough to go around.
Right, so therefore, right, what he's assuming is that you got the double harvest on the good years, and you're saving 1/5 of the double harvest in order to be able to provide the food for the famine years to balance it out, right? Because 1/5 of it,
it's a half harvest. It's still a half harvest. It's
right.
Not like there's nothing.
So, and 1/5 of the, what's that?
I said, famine doesn't mean there's zero.
Famine doesn't mean it's zero, exactly, because then everyone would die every time there was a famine, and there'd be no human civilization, right? But it does mean that if you take 1/5 of the double quantity and you save that, then by the time there's a famine and you're adding back 1/5 of that double, it actually works out, 20% of 4 times more than what you're getting at the famine. That actually works out to be pretty good in a famine year. That 20% you saved during the good years is going to be worth an awful lot during the lean years. Does that make sense? Almost, doubling what you're getting during the famine, so that people will not have to starve. But you need to have the foresight. You need to have someone who can do the math, but you need to have the foresight to recognize that I can't, or maybe I shouldn't, or don't need to eat all of this now that I'm getting during my years of plenty, because that 20% I set aside still leaves me with, much more than I would eat in a regular year. But that 20% will come back and pay me back multiple times when it's a lean year, right? The money that I saved for the rainy day is worth a lot more to me during the rainy day than it was when I was just blowing it, buying a new pair of shoes.
You don't need to spend every penny that you make.
You don't need to spend every money, and your disposable income today can become your essential income in difficult times. And when it's your essential income, you're going to be much more thankful for it than you were for your extra pair of shoes when it was only disposable. Does that economic theory make sense? Yes, and our ancestors have understood that for a few thousand years. It's what got Joseph appointed, that it's better to save now because we're really going to need it during these 7 years of famine. And when we need it, boy, we're going to be thankful we have it. Whereas if we eat it during the feast, so we're a little fatter. That's not actually such a big benefit.
I'm wondering if the people who are doing the growing would have said, look, we got twice as much as we usually do. I'm going to give 20% to Pharaoh. I'm going to keep another 20% for my own. If he has such a good idea, maybe I should see.
And it's a very interesting question, because why didn't the Egyptians themselves save that much more? Now, part of it has to do with that middle section that Joseph is talking about, that they're going to be stored in the cities. That storing the extra grain long-term, 7 years worth, was something that was usually beyond the capability of the individual farmer. So farmers could have stored for a few years, but they would not necessarily have been able to store all of that excess. And that was needed. That's why you needed a government program. You needed this project of cities, storage cities, to be able to be built on such a large scale to store food safely.
But they were storing it for the whole population.
Exactly.
I'm only storing enough for my family or to make some money when it's a lean year. I don't have to store.
True, and indeed, people did store year after year for themselves.
Okay.
But from what I remember reading in the historical stuff of this, is that storing 7 years worth, the time, it wasn't just the quantity, but it was also the time, that having a properly built structure that could keep it fresh enough while it dried, so it wasn't rotting and it wasn't becoming unedible, and also protected so that it wasn't being eaten by the mice and other things. That wasn't something that the average farmer would be able to get 7 years worth of storage out of. You might be able to store it year after year, maybe 2 years of worth of storage, but storing this much excess, it would have been wasted. Without the planning to prepare, they would have had, let's say they would have been able to store 2 years worth of food. That would have only gotten them through 5 years, or for 2 years of famine, they would have had 5 more years to go. And to be fair, for the average person, 7 years of famine is pretty bizarre. That's pretty rare. A 1 year drought, a 2 year drought, yeah, sure. But 4 years, 5, 6, 7, it would have felt like this thing's never going to end. And as a matter of fact, we get exactly that emotion, not for us to read today, but when you read ahead throughout the parasha, among the brothers up in Egypt, up in Canaan, right there, after the second year of the famine, they're looking at each other going, how much longer is this going to go on? The first couple of years, they didn't run off to Egypt to get extra food. The first couple of years, they were okay. They were, they had their little nest egg, their self, their own storage. But after 2 years and no sign that the famine is going to stop, okay, now we're in trouble.
How many people knew that it was going to be 7 years? The Pharaoh knew it because Joseph told him.
Right.
But was it common knowledge that, hey, we only got another 3 years to go, hang in there?
That's a great question. I've never seen a scholarly analysis of how widely known. Obviously Joseph had to organize a whole bureaucracy to mobilize the population to put the storage, the food into the proper storage facilities. And he probably had to give some explanation for why we're doing this, because after all, Pharaoh, whether he was paying the people or not, it's a little unclear. He was taking 20% of their harvests during these good years, and that left them plenty to live on. But that was still 20% of what they had grown. So I've never found a good explanation of exactly how it was explained to the people, and whether there was buy-in, whether Pharaoh was buying the food from them and then storing it, because he certainly turns around and sells it to them when he gives it back to them. That's how they end up becoming, the entire nation of Egypt becomes slaves to Pharaoh, by selling themselves back for the food that he's releasing during the years of famine. Really kind of nasty bit of work there, actually.
They had to build the storage facilities, right,
Mm-hmm.
around the country.
Right.
And that costs a lot of money.
Oh.
And Pharaoh paid for that probably out of the treasury. So
True.
he's looking at this, that's his infrastructure investment, and now he's recouping it.
True. You're a very good press secretary for the Pharaoh. Although, if Pharaoh was paying for the infrastructure, and then he collected the food free, he gives it back and turns the nation into slaves, that may seem like he's getting quite a good bargain for his storage facility. of enslaving the nation to build a few storage facilities. Yeah, that's fair. But I appreciate the spin.
Joseph suggested it.
Indeed, and in one of our other classes a few years ago, I talked about the fact that there may have been reasons for the native Egyptians to be resentful of the Hebrews for having known that it was Joseph, this Hebrew, that set up this plan during the years of plenty and famine that eventually turned all of the Egyptians into Pharaoh's slaves. They were slaves who lived on their own land, but they were slaves who were paying 20% rather than 10% of everything they grew forever, whether it was a year of plenty or a famine. So that might have bred some resentment after all of this was done, right? For in perpetuity, Joseph turns all of the nation of Egypt into slaves for Pharaoh, paying this 20% fee, like our first commentary was talking about. And the people might have resented the foreigner who arranged this rather than the Pharaoh who was like a god to them. Because, you know, people always like to blame the person under the revered leader for causing the problems. It's, oh, he was misled by his advisors, et cetera, et cetera. And that might have been one of the reasons why the Egyptians were willing to go along with the enslavement of the Hebrews later on. If anything, it just seemed fair. We're all slaves. Why aren't they slaves? Okay, let's go ahead, though, because this question of how much can the community gather and compel and coerce in order to take care of problems that it sees coming down the pipe is not something that only happens in years of plenty and famine, and not only when there are dreams, but it's a day-to-day concern of every community. It's what we call taxes.
Rashi suggests their grain, which they had stored, had decayed, except that of Joseph.
Right. So he also has your question there, David, of, well, what happened to the grain they stored? He takes the idea that it had all decayed. I would argue that it just simply was inadequate. But, you know, again, who am I to argue with Rashi? All right. But now we get into the real tax question.
They compel him to share in the construction of the town wall, double gates, and a crossbar.
All right, so this is a little introduction from Bava Batra, one of the pieces of Mishnah. And the idea here is if the town is getting ready to build a wall, if you live in the town, you have to pay for the building of the wall and the things that make the wall useful, like, you know, a gate and a bar, since a wall without a gate is kind of not nearly as effective. But the operative word here, of course, is that you compel someone to pay for this. If the person living in the town says, I don't want a wall, or I don't care if we have a wall, they say, I don't care if you don't care. The wall is for all of us, and you're going to be paying your share. And then the question becomes, so what's your share? How do you figure out how much people have to pay to build the wall? And that's where we're going to be looking actually as part of the Talmud.
Rabbi Eliezer inquired of Rabbi Yochanan, is the impost for the wall levied as a poll tax or according to means?
Right, so question that we have all the way into the modern day, right? Do you levy it as a poll tax? A poll tax in this context means a flat tax, right? Everybody in town has to pay the same number. And a means test, of course, would be that if you are very wealthy, you pay more, and if you're very poor, you pay much less. And it just depends on how much you're able to pay. So that's the question before them. Sound familiar, like our modern debates?
Yeah.
Okay.
So he answered, it is levied according to means. And you, Eliezer, my son, fix this ruling firmly in your mind. According to another version, Rabbi Eliezer asked Rabbi Yochanan whether the impost, the tax, was levied in proportion to the proximity of the resident's house to the wall or to his means.
All right. So what's the alternative version of this same question, right?
The closer you are to the wall, the more you pay.
The closer you are to the wall, the more you pay, right? The idea being that if you live in a walled town, and this is, you know, house A that's Abraham's house, and this is house Z for Zebulun's house, that if the raiders are coming to attack or the bandits are coming to attack, who gets hit first? Mr. A, right? Abraham, which means that A benefits from the wall more or disproportionately than Zebulun does. Therefore, A should pay more for the wall. Right? You're the one benefiting directly. you're the one who should be the one paying more on that. So in modern parlance, make a little more room here. All right, so we've got the poll tax, which is a question of a flat tax, right? Everyone pays the same amount, right? And not amount percentage, but amount. Let's just call that everyone pays $100. A means tax, I left out the end, would be something along the lines of, you know, your income times 10%, right? So however much you make, you pay 10% of that. That's what your contribution is to the wall. So the more you make, the more you pay in terms of the raw number, but the percentage would be the same. Make sense? Right? The idea of proportional, the sliding proportional scale wasn't really invented yet. And then the alternative would be what we would call a usage tax. Right? This is like our gasoline tax.
Which is going up on January 1st.
Thank you for the reminder.
Yes.
I'll have to fill my tank.
Yes.
Although right now, I mean, gas is so cheap compared to what it was just a few years ago. It's almost like, really, it's still only like $2 something. I remember when it was like almost 4 or 5 in places. Okay, so income times 10. A usage tax would be something like a gasoline tax, which would be your use times a certain percentage. We'll just use 10 for an example. So the more you use it, the more you pay. Toll roads are a usage tax. Sales tax is a usage tax. That is to say, the more you buy, the more you're actually going to be paying in taxes, because it is something, theoretically at least, that you can control how much you use it, and therefore, because you're using it, you pay more. Gas tax is that way, but the idea being that the more you drive, the more you're using the roads, therefore, the more you should contribute to the road's upkeep. Make sense? Good. All of these are fair according to Jewish law in different places. Right? There's no part in Judaism that says only this, only that, only the other. There are examples of all of these, as we're going to see, that are considered perfectly fair. It's the question when they are fair. That's where we debate. And we're going to finish this one.
Rabbi Yochanan's answer was, in proportion to the proximity of his house to the wall, and Eliezer fixed this ruling firmly in your mind.
All right, so what's the great irony of this passage?
Two different answers to the same question.
And both of them in with the phrase,
Fix it
firmly in your mind. If you're going to remember this, if you're going to remember anything, remember this. And then they remember it 2 different ways.
Right.
It's like, okay, so wait a minute, which one was the real one that I was supposed to fix firmly in my mind? Because clearly this was important. It was so important, in fact, that I've got 2 versions. Yeah, so taxes have been confusing for a long time. And trying to figure out the fair way to have taxes has been confusing for a long time. But there's one example of where we have a tax in the Torah that is not confusing at all. And that's the tax of the half shekel.
Sure.
And it's one that should be coming up on our mind because as we get closer and closer to Purim, this was getting close to the time when it gets collected. And with Hanukkah almost done, we should already start to think about our next holiday. So on the back page.
On the 1st of Adar, the court would announce the collection of the half shekelim, so that every single individual would prepare his half shekel and be ready to give.
Right, so the 1st of Adar, everybody gets a note in the mail. Obviously, it wasn't, they would announce it in the marketplaces and such, because mail wasn't really like that. But for now, in modern terms, that would be what it would be like. Everyone gets a postcard that says, by the way, the half shekel tax is due soon. Just a reminder. And this half shekel was a half shekel for everyone.
On the 15th of Adar, the money changers sit in every city and would gently prod the people to give.
Right, so we're now at the middle of the month, right? And they're reminding them, they are capable of doing the exchanges so that you can, hand over your gold or your copper or whatever you've got and convert it to the appropriate half shekel weight that needs to be your payment. That's why money changers were involved in this.
If people gave them, they would accept it. If someone did not give, they would not compel him to give.
This is on the 15th, in the middle of the month.
On the 25th of Adar,
which is almost at the end.
they would sit in the temple and collect the half shekel. From this time onward, everyone who had not given a half shekel as yet would be compelled to give. When a person did not give voluntarily, his property would be taken by force as a pledge. Even his clothing was taken from him.
They were serious about this collection. This is not how we get dues, by the way.
That's not how you treat a laborer.
Well, so you're right. In most circumstances, when someone owes money, you're not allowed to strip them naked to force them to pay. But the half shekel, the government could. Why? What was the half shekel for?
It's a census.
Well, it was a census. It was a means of taking a census. But what was the money used for? The upkeep of the temple, and specifically paying for the daily sacrifices. And those were on behalf of the entire community. Those were the fundamental underpinnings of our continual worship and celebration of God. And everybody had an equal share in that, and everybody had an equal responsibility in that. That's why, like I said, there are many other things where people can or have to give a lot more depending upon what God has blessed them with. A phrase that's used very often throughout the Torah, that you would celebrate with whatever God has blessed you with, meaning if you have a lot, you give a lot. If you have a little, you give a little. But for the flat tax of the half shekel, for the supporting of the temple sacrifices on the daily basis, everybody was the same. And that was a very important principle within Judaism, was that everybody had this minimum basic contribution that was necessary, that they too were always going to be seen as equal in the support of Judaism in its most fundamental way. Does that make sense? Right? If you want to donate more and you want to do more and you want to give here or give there, and you can, go for it. And certainly in other places, like taking care of the poor, we will even tell you have to give more. The giving for the poor was one where it was always a means test, the tithing of 10% of what you have. But for this, we are all the same. And down to your clothes, you are going to live up to that obligation. Because no one can say they don't benefit from having God within the nation of Israel. I mean, that's kind of like the beginning of all other benefits. Make sense? Okay. However, there's always a however. Despite the fact that taxes in this form, tithes, half shekel, building of walls, these were considered things that were essential and that you could compel the populace to participate in. Tax collectors during the Mishnaic and Talmudic period were not always what you would call respected and honored individuals in the community. Much like now, if you were to meet someone and they were to tell you, oh, I'm an auditor for the IRS,
Yeah.
how many parties would they get invited to? You would think it's an essential job, right? The government needs this work to be done, so why should I resent the person who's doing it? Well, let's take a look at how tax collecting used to work, and then we can appreciate the beauty of the modern tax system compared to what they had to live through.
When does the statement that a customs collector is considered to be a highwayman apply?
Right. Anybody who's collecting taxes, collecting custom duties, they're a robber, right? You're no better than a thief on the road. Under what circumstances does that apply?
They're a robber when the customs collector is a Gentile,
Meaning,
a star worshiper,
right, Ovdei Kochavim, these were the idol worshippers in the past.
is self-appointed, or was appointed by the king, but is given unlimited jurisdiction and takes whatever he wants and leaves whatever he wants.
All right. So those were all very real circumstances. You would have someone who was outside the community making assessments upon you, and you would be unlikely to get a fair assessment. Right? That's what they mean by the Ovdei Kochavim, the star worshippers. So someone comes in that is antithetical and antagonistic towards Judaism, which during the days of the Talmud was certainly the norm. And they're saying, yeah, your farm here, it's a nice farm. In fact, it's worth about 5 times more than you think it's worth. And you'll be paying taxes on that. It's a robber, right? The person is abusing me and the system, and they are stealing money that does not rightly belong to them or the government. We're self-appointed. all the more so. The person says, I'm the tax collector around here. Nowadays, we generally call that a protection racket, where you will pay me taxes to not harm you. Appointed by the king, but given unlimited jurisdiction. This may be an overlap with the first. You all know the story of Robin Hood, right? Right? And Robin Hood was fighting against the sheriff of Nottingham. Well, the way that used to work in England and in under Roman and other ancient empires was you would often have the king appoint someone, and the king would expect that person to give them, let's say, 1,000 gold pieces. And then that person could get as much from the people as they can get from the people, right? So what's their incentive?
To get more from the people.
To get more than 1,000, right? It's their job is not just to pay back the 1,000 they either had to give the king or they chose to give the king, right? Because king's first job is, I want a consistent revenue stream. So if they can find some guy who's willing to promise 1,000 gold coins, they'll give him authority to go torture the population as long as the king gets his 1,000. And then the guy goes out and tortures the population to get way more than 1,000, because everything above 1,000 he gets to keep. Right? It's a good deal. Imagine if we had IRS auditors who got to keep whatever they are able to get from the people that they are auditing. Would you consider that to be a fair and impartial process? No, I mean, we don't consider audits to be fair and impartial at the moment, if we're on the receiving end of it, especially. But if we knew the auditor was keeping whatever they were getting out of the people that were being audited, we would probably feel that they were unlikely to be inclined to fair and honest assessments, because it's not in their interest to be fair. It's in their interest to skew. But
if, however, the customs collector was appointed by the king to take a third, a fourth, or any fixed amount, such person is not considered to be a robber.
So even if they're appointed by a non-Jewish king, if the person has been, excuse me, it's a little late to tell me that the sound isn't working. Nope. I mean, it's not the sound, it's something else. But if the person was appointed with a specific, this is what percentage you will be collecting, then that's okay. And the tax collector is not a highwayman, they're not a robber, they are doing their job, and they are doing the duly appointed work of the government. In fact,
the law established by the king is binding law.
Right, dina de malchuta dina, right? The law of the land, of the kingdom, of the sovereignty is law. That's considered to be a binding Jewish principle, that we follow the laws of the country, even when it's not a Jewish king that is making those decrees. And we follow them not just because we don't want to get punished, we follow them because observing the laws, the secular laws of a foreign nation is something that is considered to have been first expounded on by the prophet Jeremiah, but then ratified and continually codified by our sages over the centuries. That we are under a religious obligation to obey the secular laws of the state in which we live, as long as they don't violate Judaism, obviously. Now, if they tell us to go out and murder people, then we're going to have to break that law. But if they tell us to drive 55 or pay 20% taxes, we observe the law. Even if we don't necessarily agree with the underlying policy ideas of the law, we observe the law. And we observe it as Jews, not just as citizens. Go on.
Indeed, anyone who does not pay this tax transgresses, for he is taking what is due the king.
Right, so if you don't pay the taxes that are fair, that were appointed by the king, and the king gave specific instructions, and that's what's being collected, if you don't pay those taxes, you are actually violating Jewish law, not just secular law. I know, everyone was hoping to find a loophole, weren't they? Judaism says I don't have to pay tax. No, pretty much the opposite. Pretty much the opposite. So let's go ahead and...
As to tax farmers and tax collectors, doing penitence is difficult.
Right? Tshuva is hard if you've been one of these guys on the bad side and you were being unfair. Why?
They return what they can to those whom they recognize. And the rest of the taxes that they propose to hand back, they make use for the public good.
Right. So let's say you're the sheriff of Nottingham, and at the end of the story, you finally realize the error of your ways, and you just, I was such a terrible person. I have, tortured all this money out of the poor people. I want to give it back to the poor people. Him I took 3 extra coins from, and him I took 2, and the rest of you I don't remember. All right, but I know this much extra money was definitely wrong. I will use it, therefore, to do something for the public good, right? To build a school, build a bridge, do something. What's that? So we have questions in the modern world of people who have been embezzlers and scammers and schemers of how does the money get back to the people they've wronged? And very often, like Michael Milken, they can't give it directly back to the people they belong to, and so the money is often confiscated and then used for something that is supposed to be in the public good. The idea being that in the collective, it eventually reaches those they wronged as best it can, given that we can't find the specific person. I know that there has been a lot of litigation regarding thank you, Madoff. I was coming up with Abramoff, but that was different. That was a different enough. Yeah. So, but Bernie Madoff, there was the big issue of trying to figure out who deserved what little money was left that would go back to them, because there was no way to actually pay back everybody what everybody had been promised, and they did the best they could. There were more financial records, so it was a little easier to figure out somewhat of who was owed what. Then it was just what was fair to give to each group that was under debate. Onward.
Said Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, it is forbidden for a person to have sexual relations in times of famine, as it is said, and to Joseph were born 2 sons before the year of famine.
Right. So why would you not have children during the time of famine? Yeah. Duh. Right? You're going to have kids now and you can't afford to feed them because there's a famine going on? That doesn't make sense, right? You're going to be giving birth to them just to watch them starve and die. Better you should not have children during this time. However, there is a debate, not about the having children, but about the intimacy question, which the Tanaite
say childless couples have sexual relations in years of famine.
Right, but if you don't have any children yet, because it is a mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply, then yes, you should be.
At least try.
You should still be trying, because having children is a commandment in and of itself. So one who has children should not be trying to make more mouths to feed. One who have no children should definitely try to have children, because that's a mitzvah in and of itself. But the idea that there is some responsibility of trying to balance your balance your output versus your input. If you're not making enough to support children, don't have children, unless you have no children, in which case, yes, having children is a basic human need. Make sense?
Yeah.
All right.
But still, it's not, you say be fruitful and multiply, except when it's not a good year.
Well, yeah, because you're not being fruitful, are you?
I didn't say, he didn't put a caveat, he said be fruitful and multiply.
Correct. And that's why the sages felt that it had to be clarified, that what Joseph did by having his children before the famine began was setting an example.
And he fulfilled the mitzvah.
But
He already had children.
he knew the famine was going to be 7 years. The average person, if they weren't told, like I said before, he says, look, 9 months from now, the famine will be over, we'll be okay.
Oh.
Why should I not start the process?
Well, but that's the point. The average person doesn't know how long it will last. And so the average person all the more so should refrain from bringing more children into a world without any guarantee that they're going to be able to feed them if it continues longer than they hope it will be. If you knew it was going to be done next year, all right, then there's some reason
But you know,
for
by
hope.
precedent, every other famine has lasted 2 years. This one is a super famine.
And all the more so if you honestly believe the famine is only going to be 2 years,
Right.
then you only have to wait 2 years.
But you know, 9 months.
Right, so that's the idea, that while the famine is on, that's very pretty. While the famine is on, wait. And if it's a typical famine, it'll be over soon, and then you can be back to having children. And if it's an extraordinary famine, then you're going to be very thankful that you didn't have children, because it will be, so much more debilitating.
Samuel stated, the law of the land is the law.
which is what we had mentioned before in Bava Kama.
Rava said, observe that this must be true.
Right, so he's bringing a proof of this, not from Jeremiah as is usual, but from logic.
Because it's the government that fells trees and builds bridges, and we cross them.
So what's his argument?
You use them.
Yeah,
Benefit.
you're benefiting from the government, so you're acknowledging the good it does to you. Therefore, you should. What's that?
So therefore pay it.
Yeah. So therefore, acknowledge your debt, your responsibility to observe its laws and to participate in doing the good that it does for you. If you want to say the government has no right to take my money, that's fine, and then you have no right to take any of the benefits the government has given, including bridges and other such public goods in the ancient world, and roads and whatnot. But once you accept the good that's been given to you, then you are tacitly saying, I may not agree with everything, but I do have a place, I do have a part to play, and I will observe the laws as long as they're not directly contradictory to Torah. And it's an important procedure. We see, I know you have to go. It's an important point that, as we've discussed from the beginning with the Joseph story and what happens in Egypt, that the government has an obligation to do good for the community, and the community has an obligation to participate in the doing of good that the government has laid out, whether it be preparing for famine or building walls or making bridges or other public services. We are all in this together, and up to and including force sometimes is necessary to make sure that the public good can actually be carried out. So there's no radical individualism in Judaism. There's no also radical, give up yourself to the only the public good. Judaism likes to walk a fine line of we are individuals and we have rights, and we also have obligations to the community, and we try to serve all of that at the same time. Good? Okay. Have a good rest of Hanukkah and a happy secular new year.